Okay, good afternoon. This is going to be the last session today before the museum tour and then our dinner later on. As you know, as we said before, Professor Allan Peskin was not able to be here due to a medical emergency. He seems to be doing okay now, but he's still in the hospital. At each one of your places, you should have a copy of the speech that he developed for today, which will give you some more background on General Winfield Scott. And also, Professor Walter McDougall is graciously going to give us a few minutes on General Scott and his importance in military history. Before I turn it over to him, though, we just passed out a few things. One of them is a handout on teaching military history, teaching American military history. I also wanted to let you know that Sam Watson before talked about the iPad instructional booklet that the history department at USAMA is putting out. I also wanted to let you know that FPRI and the 1st Division Museum also are going to be coming out with an ebook that will be free of charge and available on our websites called American Military History, a resource for teachers and students that should be out in the next month or so, online available, that you and your students can make use of. But without further ado, co-chairman of our history, the Madeline and Keen Butcher History Institutes, Professor Walter McDougall.
Hi, I'm just insinuating myself here, or imposing myself on you for just a few minutes, I hope not many, simply because our speaker on Winfield Scott, as you know, is ill. And you do have his paper in hand, and I urge you all to read it when you have leisure. But I just think Winfield Scott is too important to, thank you, there you are. He's too important to be dropped from the program without some mention. He's probably the most important American military leader between Washington and Grant, or between the Revolution and the Civil War. And particularly since we had a session on Andrew Jackson, it's very important, I think, to pair him with Winfield Scott. So I'm just going to pick out a few facts from the paper and add a few more that aren't in the paper in order to just introduce him to you if you don't know him, because that's the whole point that Peskin makes at the very beginning of his paper. He says, I told people I was going to write a biography of Winfield Scott, and they all said, who? Well, this man's been forgotten. Why? Well, his biography can be briefly told. He's described in the paper as a landless, slaveless, fatherless Virginian. That sounds very forlorn. It's true his family had fallen on hard times, but in fact, he was a scion of one of the first families of Virginia, which is why he had so much ambition, aspired to live up to his background with some kind of a great career, just he didn't have the money to pursue it. He went to William and Mary for a while, and of course he also had the advantage of some political patronage in the sense of Thomas Jefferson paying attention to him. In those days, as I'm sure you all know, nobody got credentialed. We're dying of credentials in this country. But back in the early republic, almost nobody got credentialed. You were very fortunate if you got to go to have a formal education. If you wanted to be a lawyer, you read law. As a teenager, you just read books. Hopefully you'd been trained to read. And then you apprenticed with a lawyer. Andrew Jackson did that. Abraham Lincoln, of course. Physicians, teachers, none of them had credentials. And so Winfield Scott thought he was going to be a lawyer, but then when Thomas Jefferson looked for people to police the American people to enforce his own embargo, his trade embargo, and was posting military units along the coast to prevent smuggling, Winfield Scott volunteered, got himself an appointment, and that began the longest active duty career in United States history. Winfield Scott served a as a commissioned officer for 53 years, 47 of them with the rank of brigadier general or above. Now, of course, we know that Americans were not interested in having a large standing army. They feared that an army would be turned against the people. And so we have this contrary tradition, the militia tradition. And so Winfield Scott is sort of the patron of professionalism as opposed to this militia tradition. Well, how did he wait a minute, you said he was not credentialed. How did he become the patron of professionalism? Well, his first assignment was in Louisiana. Interesting, because that was wild country out in those days, and the officers out there were corrupt, incompetent, or sly, as in James Wilkinson, who was secretly a Spanish agent, double agent, and a co-conspirator of Aaron Burr. And Winfield Scott ran afoul of General Wilkinson, and he got himself relieved of duty for a time. He offered to resign, but no, he was given some enforced leisure, as Peskin puts it, which he put to good use. Once again, self-study, devouring books on military history, military theory, and military procedure. Who wrote these books? Well, most of them were written by Frenchmen, the Napoleonic era, or some British, but reading them in translation. But he's getting his education self-taught from Europe. And then, of course, the War of 1812 is declared, and Winfield Scott gets his chance. He commanded on the Niagara frontier in the early years of the war, years that went very badly, as you know, for the United States. But he particularly developed an animus against militias. The New York State militia had been called up, but refused to cross the river in order to engage the enemy because they suddenly realized that, well, we're militia. We don't have to fight outside the boundaries of our own state, much less country. So they're all hot to invade Canada until the time comes, and then they chicken out. And Scott developed this great antipathy to amateur soldiers at that time. Well, in 1814, the Madison administration finally wises up and makes wholesale changes in the War and Navy departments, and clears out a lot of old officers and promotes young ones, including Winfield Scott, who was made a brigadier general at the age of 27. Not quite as good as Napoleon did, but pretty good. And Winfield Scott took the knowledge he'd gotten from these European books, and he sat down and he created a small army or force of his own by himself, drilling. And once his units went into battle, of course they performed marvelously well. The British were amazed that these American rabble were behaving like regulars. And Lundy's Lane is probably his most famous engagement in the War of 1812. And he became, for a time, America's top military hero. We had lots of naval heroes in the War of 1812, but this is, finally, we have a military hero, only to be surpassed within a few months' time by Andrew Jackson and his great victory at New Orleans. And that foreshadowed really a kind of 50 years. It's about a 50-year divide in America between the ideal of professionalism and the myth of the citizen soldier, the militiaman. Now, this split, we learned this morning in the Andrew Jackson talk, has perhaps been overdrawn. That Andrew Jackson encouraged, or at least did not get in the way of the professionalization of the Army, and Scott's professionalism didn't always serve him well. So maybe this divide has been exaggerated. We exaggerate many things in the classroom to make things simpler and to make an impression on students. But at any rate, Winfield Scott really does deserve the reputation as the individual who did probably more than anyone, except for a commandant or two at West Point, to professionalize the United States Army. He wrote, after the war, he wrote drill instructions, tactical manuals, and, of course, his great magnum opus, the General Regulations for the Army, known as Scott's Institutes. This is a how-to book for how to run an army. all aspects of an army, tactics, but also logistics and discipline and everything else. And a modern business historian, has called this book, quote, the first comprehensive management manual published in the United States, unquote. And indeed, it's said to have become a kind of a model for the operating manual for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which in turn became a model for the corporate entity in the United States. His professional tactics didn't serve him well in the Seminole War in Florida, where he went down there with a kind of a plan to replicate Hannibal's campaign at Cannae, and he was going to surround the Indians and put the rebellion to rest, and of course it turned into a fiasco. But during those interwar years, he also served as a military statesman of high order. Whenever there was trouble on the frontier, presidents would invariably turn to Winfield Scott, send him out there, cool those people down, keep the peace, which he did in the nullification crisis when he raised troops to back the so-called force bill in case it was necessary against the South Carolinians. He observed on the New York-Canadian border during the Canadian Rebellion of the 1830s to ensure that American citizens didn't violate Canadian sovereignty and start trouble with the British. He did the same thing in disputed Maine during the so-called Aroostook War in 1839, and he would do the same thing on the Pacific Northwest coast in the diplomatic quarrel over ownership of the San Juan Islands in the Puget Sound in 1859. I might add also that he was very much involved in the organization of the Indian removal, and wasn't happy with his duty at all, and tried his best to be humane toward the Indians and tell his subordinate commanders to tell their troops to make sure they were humane to the Indians. It didn't do very much good. The whole thing was utterly underfunded. Talk about an unfunded mandate. But he did his best. And then, of course, he became famous, even more famous, with the war in Mexico. The Mexican War is hugely complicated and fascinating. It's too bad we don't have more time to talk about it. Combined arms were really pioneered in the Mexican War, and Winfield Scott had a good role to play in that. The United States Navy and the Army coordinated magnificently in the seizure of Veracruz that allowed the Army to get ashore in the first place. But his strategic plan, once he was ashore, was to make straight for Mexico City along Cortez's invasion route. Sounds simple, but of course it wasn't. There were mountain ranges. There were many, many miles. There were virtually no good roads in Mexico, and it was an extraordinary campaign. In 6 months, he marched about 300 miles. He fought 7 major battles against armies that were always larger than his own, and it was this campaign that earned him the plaudits of the Duke of Wellington, who called it a campaign unsurpassed in military annals and called Winfield Scott the world's greatest living soldier. Of course, he had some help. He had some extraordinarily talented young West Point graduates under his command, including Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and William Tecumseh Sherman. I'm sure you've all seen his entry into the famous painting of Scott's entry into Mexico City, and you'll see in the distance the Stars and Stripes. That's the first time the Stars and Stripes ever flew over a foreign capital. And that was the war in which the American flag truly became Old Glory, beloved of the American people. Thousands of, all of a sudden, flag manufacturers sprang into business, and they couldn't manufacture enough flags to sell to the American people who wanted to wave the flag in a war that many Americans would come to condemn later on, but Americans engaged in a kind of an orgy of patriotism over the fact that their flag was flying over foreign territory. Well, by the way, he also, after occupying Mexico City, very quickly clued in, Scott did, to the danger of a guerrilla war insurrection on the part of various Mexican factions. And he warned President Polk, we got to get out of here. We conquered Mexico, we're in Mexico City, but you got to pull this army out of here before all kind of hell breaks loose. And luckily, thanks to the peace treaty, we were able to do that. Well, he would continue, of course, as commanding general of the army all the way on down to the Civil War. The article, however, neglects to mention that in 1852, the Whig political party, that had never had any success except when they nominated a military hero, prevailed upon Scott to be their candidate. He didn't get the good advice that Pershing got. Don't do it or you'll be forgotten. Instead, Winfield Scott allowed himself to be nominated for president. Unfortunately, the Whig Party was on the verge of cracking up in 1852. The platform it mandated the Compromise of 1850, which is a way of saying that the Whig Party was okay with slavery, which the Southern wing of the party, of course, insisted on. That platform alienated many Northern voters, while Scott himself, who was anti-slavery, despite being a Virginian, alienated many Southern voters. He ended up winning 4 states. I'll leave you to figure out which ones they were. Now, Scott also was damaged, I think, in this campaign by his personality. The fact is, he was. Oh, we've lost it. Maybe I pushed the wrong button. What? Okay. Well, forget about it. He was pompous. He had a certain pride about him. But Scott had another weakness as a candidate, political candidate: candor. Winfield Scott, as a good Virginia gentleman, took honor very seriously, and he tended to tell the truth. He tended to tell the truth. Well, I'm not saying anything about any other individual in American history, military or political, but telling the truth can get us into trouble. And Scott disqualified himself, shall we say, from political office. But he remained, as a general, he's still respected highly, promoted to lieutenant general, brevet, in 1855 by Congress, the first lieutenant general since George Washington. And then, of course, as you know, in 1861, Scott was still on board as the commander-in-chief and devised a plan for how to wage the war against the Southern Rebellion. Journalists called it the Anaconda Plan. He didn't ever come up with that name, but he certainly did advocate a plan of blockading the southern coast with the United States Navy, seizing the Mississippi River, securing the Ohio River, and seizing the Mississippi River, and then squeezing the Confederacy slowly to death. I don't know that that plan, in general terms, turned out to be the plan that won the Civil War. Only I don't think it could have worked the way Scott wanted it to work, because he was hoping to avoid major battles that would inflame the South and make this war horribly bitter. I have a feeling that the impatience of the American people, North and South, let's get it over with, let's win, the overconfidence as well of the American people was such that the big battles were going to be fought. So even though Scott's Anaconda Plan sort of turned out to be the grand strategy, unfortunately, the long, bitter, and bloody war was necessary anyway. So why has he been largely forgotten, old fuss and feathers? Well, his pomposity. He was a kind of a strutter. The fact that he fought in the Mexican War, which turned out to be a very unpopular cause with free soilers, and we're ashamed of it today. So on and so on. I think and the fact that he ran for president and got clobbered. All those things explain why Winfield Scott has not gone down in history the way perhaps he should have. But the question that I have that hangs in the air is, could Winfield Scott, or and many other great military leaders that we read about in the 19th century, could he even serve, much less rise to the top in today's professional, bureaucratized military? I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect it's no. Thanks.